Have you ever walked into a room where everyone had already decided who you were? And worse, decided you didn't matter? My name is Margot Hale, and I've spent most of my adult life being respected in courtrooms and ignored in dining rooms. Out there, I'm Your Honor. In here, at home, I'm just the older sister no one introduces properly. The night of Camille's engagement party, I didn't expect applause. I didn't expect warmth. I only wanted the silence to end. The silence that had followed me from childhood through law school and into every family gathering where I became the coat rack in the corner. But what I didn't expect was that one sentence, spoken calmly, clearly, could shift the entire room. That truth, when timed right, didn't need to scream. It just needed to land. Before I tell you what happened that night, how my sister smirked, how her fiancé laughed, and how the judgment melted into silence, let me take you back. Because some verdicts begin long before they're ever spoken. And this one? It started with a message that said, "Don't wear anything too serious." The invitation came in a white envelope with rose gold foil and a hint of perfume I recognized instantly. Camille's signature overcompensation. Inside, it said, "Join us in celebrating the engagement of Camille Hale and Andrew Preston." No mention of me, no +1, no personal note. Just a text 2 hours later. "Hi sis, no pressure if you can't make it. Andrew's family is kind of high profile. Try not to wear anything too serious, okay? XX Camille. Too serious." I stared at that line like it was written in bold. She wasn't talking about clothes. Not really. She never was. That phrase had followed me all my life. From school forms to dinner tables. Too serious when I asked real questions. Too serious when I didn't laugh on cue. Too serious when I wanted space instead of spectacle. Camille wore charm like perfume, light, sweet, and calculated. I wore structure, law, logic, order, and she hated it. So, the dress code wasn't about pastels or florals. It was a warning, a reminder to stay in my assigned place, decorative, forgettable, quiet. She wanted me there as a shadow, not a sister. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that black is what I wear when I mean business, not drama, not grief, authority. I chose a tailored black sheath, minimalist jewelry, and flats that wouldn't click when I walked. I didn't pack for performance, I packed for presence. And as I zipped the suitcase, I remember thinking, not for the first time, how odd it is that people who never asked who you really are still feel entitled to tell you how to show up. But power doesn't always enter a room with noise. Sometimes it sits in silence until someone mistakes it for nothing. And that night, at Camille's engagement party, they mistook me. Again. Which brings me to the beginning, not of the evening, but of something much older. Let me tell you about growing up invisible. Because before I learned how to wield silence, I had to survive in it. I didn't grow up planning to be silent. It just became the safest choice. In our house, Camille sparkled. She cried pretty, laughed loudly, and knew how to tilt her head just enough to be forgiven before she even finished breaking something. Me? I read quietly in corners and got in trouble for correcting people too much. It didn't take long to learn. Being right didn't matter. Being likable did. Every family has a golden child. Camille wore that crown before she could spell it. When she snuck out of the house, my parents called it just a phase. When I stayed up late studying, they called me too intense. I remember one Thanksgiving, she spilled cranberry juice on my college entrance essay, laughed, said it looked better with color. I had to rewrite it by hand. No one said a word to her. My mom just smiled and said, Let it go, Margot. You're too sensitive. That sentence shaped me more than any teacher or textbook ever did. So I learned to be quiet, to not expect praise, to shrink into the background where no one could twist my words or laugh at my effort. Silence, eventually, felt like armor. Unnoticed, yes, but at least untouched. By high school, Camille was throwing house parties I wasn't invited to in the very house I lived in. Told her friends I was just a cousin who liked books. Once I heard her say, "Margot's not fun, she's useful." And that was the best she could give me. I stopped trying after that. No one ever asked me where I went after school. No one noticed when I got into Columbia early. No one visited when I graduated top of my class. But I kept going, not for applause, for clarity. Because sometimes the silence you build around yourself isn't loneliness, it's scaffolding. And what I built from that silence? Well, let's just say it carried more weight than any compliment they never gave. Which brings us to the night of the party, to the polished tables, the curated smiles, the introductions that skipped over my name. Because no matter how far you've come, there's always someone ready to reduce you back to a version of yourself that no longer exists. And they almost did, until one question changed everything. If any part of this feels familiar, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments if you're ready. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. We speak in truth here, quiet but strong. At the party, no one introduced me, not once. I stood there with a glass of champagne and a lifetime of credentials, and not a single person thought to ask, "What do you do?" Instead, they smiled that polite, glazed-over kind of smile you give to coat racks and distant cousins. Camille fluttered from group to group, telling elaborate stories, some true, most strategic. She's very close with the mayor's daughter. She used to work in PR for a nonprofit. She has such an eye for design. Her voice carried. Mine didn't need to. When she finally reached me, it was as if she were meeting an obligation. "Look who made it," she chirped, as if my presence were a surprise, not a response to an invitation. I nodded. Just happened to have the evening free. She tilted her head, scanned my black dress like it was a puzzle. "Always so classic," she said, then lowered her voice. "Just, don't be too serious tonight, okay? Andrew's family asks a lot of questions." I smiled, not because it was funny, because it was familiar. That moment, it wasn't about clothes or conversation. It was about containment. She didn't care what my title was. She had already written her own version of me, a shadow sister who worked somewhere vaguely bureaucratic and showed up to family events out of obligation, not presence. And Andrew? He played along. Later, during dinner, he leaned over with a soft chuckle. "Camille says you work in records or something?" Then added, like it was a compliment, "Honestly, it's great to have someone in the family who keeps things organized." I blinked once. No offense in his tone. Just casual erasure, served cold and smiling. I didn't correct him. Not then. Because when someone's already decided who you are, giving them the truth too early feels like talking to a locked door. But sometimes, the door creaks open, and all it takes is one sentence, placed just right, for the entire room to shift. And when Camille stood to give her speech, and the spotlight hit her sequin dress like a crown, that door? It swung open wider than she ever expected. Let me tell you what happened when the mic turned her words into a performance, and mine into a verdict. There's a quiet kind of test that happens at dinner tables. You've probably taken it before without realizing. Who gets asked questions? And who gets passed the bread? That night, I was seated at the far end, partly by choice, partly by choreography, the kind of placement that says, "We didn't forget you, we just didn't expect you to matter." I watched Camille float between guests like a champagne bubble, light, polished, effervescent. Every toast clinked louder when it involved her. Every laugh curved toward her end of the table. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with practiced grace, tapping her glass gently. "I just want to say how grateful I am," she began. "Camera phones lifted. Flash ready." She smiled wide, then glanced at me like a setup before a punchline. Growing up, I was the wild one. Margot was the opposite. So serious, always correcting people. Polite chuckles. She leaned in. She once filed a complaint because I borrowed her sweater without asking. I was 13. More laughter. Even Andrew grinned, elbowing her gently as if to say, "Be nice." But this was her stage, and she wasn't done. "I'm honestly just touched she came tonight," Camille continued, turning back to the room. "She's not really into big family gatherings. Or smiling." Then she winked. At me, as if it were all a light-hearted joke. My fork rested beside a plate I hadn't touched. My expression? Still. I'd seen worse performances. Hell, I'd sentenced worse liars. Then Andrew turned to me, voice sweet and oblivious. "But really," he said, "we're glad you made time. Camille said you work in admin or county records." He meant it kindly, which somehow made it worse. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the erasure. The casual way a woman's work, her name, her impact, can be reduced to paperwork. Said in passing, as if it wasn't supposed to matter. I took a slow sip of water, then looked him in the eye. "I'm sorry," I said calmly. "Where did you hear that?" He blinked. "Camille mentioned it. Something about you working for the government." I let the moment stretch. Let the silence sit like a gavel raised. "No," I said, "that's not correct." And before anyone could wave it off, before Camille could giggle and redirect the room, I gave them the truth. Not as a defense, but as a sentence. Let me tell you what happened when the label they gave me collided with the title I had earned. "I don't work in administration," I said. Still calm, still steady. Camille let out a breathy laugh, the kind she used in high school when caught in a lie, but still trying to charm her way out. "Oh, come on," she said, waving her hand. "Don't be so dramatic." I turned to Andrew, still holding his gaze. "She's right," I said, pausing just long enough. "I don't work in admin. I'm a judge." The silence was immediate, sharp, like a dropped glass that didn't shatter, but echoed. It took a beat before someone spoke. From the left side of the table, a woman in green tilted her head. "Wait, Judge Hale? The sentencing on the Langford case?" And there it was. Recognition. Not from my family, not from Camille, but from someone who'd paid attention to the world I actually lived in. A few heads turned. A man at the center table adjusted his tie. Phones discreetly appeared under linen napkins, Googling, confirming. "District 11, I added softly. "Superior Court." Andrew's smile dropped slowly, like a curtain at the end of a bad play. He looked at Camille, then back at me, and said nothing. Camille blinked. Once. Then again. I watched her process the weight of a truth she hadn't bothered to ask about. "I didn't know," she muttered. "I thought you'd moved on from that." I placed my napkin gently on the table, folding it with the same care I folded my career into silence for years. "I didn't move on," I said. "I moved forward." And in that moment, I didn't need a microphone. I didn't need to raise my voice, because sometimes a single truth spoken without apology, does what applause never could. It shifts the air. But of course, after truth comes reaction, and not all of them are pretty. Let me show you what happens when people realize the version of you they invented is no longer useful. Ever had a moment like that? When the room finally saw you, not because you raised your voice, but because truth has weight? Tell me below. And if this story speaks to you, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. I didn't stay for dessert. There was nothing sweet left to taste. As I walked out, past the murmurs, the sudden silence, the sideways glances, I didn't feel triumphant. Just done. Done performing. Done apologizing for being more than they expected and less than they could handle. The night air was cool, clean, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention. It just exists. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed. Once, then again. First, a missed call from my mother, then 2 texts from Camille. You should have told me. Why would you embarrass me like that? And there it was. Not an apology, not a moment of reflection, just blame, wrapped in entitlement, as if my truth was a weapon, as if being honest, when asked directly, was an attack. But the thing is, she never asked. Not once in 10 years did she call to check where I'd landed. She didn't ask what I did, where I lived, how I built my life. She assumed. And then she labeled. And then she expected me to fit quietly into the version of me that was most convenient for her story. You should have told me, she said. But no, you should have cared enough to ask. And if you didn't, you don't get to be surprised by the answer. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because the conversation she wanted wasn't about understanding. It was about control. And I've spent too many years building something that no longer needs her permission to exist. What I realized that night wasn't just who they were. It was who I no longer needed to be. And sometimes the most powerful recognition doesn't come from others. It comes from the moment you stop explaining yourself at all. I didn't get a standing ovation, no slow clap, no dramatic apology, no mother running after me with tears in her eyes. Hollywood loves redemption arcs. Real life? It deals in silence. But not all silence is equal. As I stood to leave, napkin folded, chair tucked in, there was a shift. Subtle, but unmistakable. Andrew didn't speak. His eyes followed me, not with arrogance, but with something else now. Awareness. Like he was rereading a book and realizing he'd missed the entire plot. A woman near the bar, one of Camille's friends, murmured something under her breath. I heard my name. Then, Langford trial. Then, nothing. Just a hush that spread like spilled ink. And my mother? She didn't move. But for the first time in years, she looked at me. Really looked. Not through me, not around me, at me. No one said the words. But that's the thing about recognition. It doesn't always need sound. Sometimes it's the quiet that speaks the loudest. The way a room stills when truth enters. The pause between laughter that used to mock you and the silence that now respects you. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't revenge. It was gravity. And I let it settle. I didn't need to turn around. I didn't need to hear my name whispered again, or see Google searches lighting up beneath tablecloths. Because what I carried out of that room wasn't applause. It was proof. And as I stepped into the night, heels steady, head high, I knew one thing for certain. Some exits are louder than entrances, and some truths, once spoken, don't need to echo. They just stay. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a speech. I didn't look back. Because when something no longer holds power over you, you don't need to destroy it. You just leave it behind. The drive home was quiet. No music, no voice messages. Just the soft rhythm of tires on pavement and a calm I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't rehearsing comebacks in my head. I wasn't rewriting the night. I didn't need to, because I hadn't gone there to prove anything. I went to stand in my own skin, fully, finally. And I did. Camille would spin her version. My mother would shift the story to something more comfortable. Andrew would process the difference between who he thought I was and who I actually am. But none of that mattered now, because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel erased. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel other. I felt free, not because they understood, but because I stopped needing them to. And maybe that's the quiet kind of power no one warns you about, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand. It just arrives, like truth, like breath, like a woman walking out of a room where she was never supposed to be seen, and choosing finally to be seen anyway. If you've ever walked out of a room freer than when you walked in, you understand. Leave a comment below. And if you'd like more stories of quiet strength, subscribe. We don't shout here. We remember. We rise.